December 1942, high above the Bismarck Sea. A 19-year-old waist gunner named Eddie Merrick braces himself in the belly of a B-24 Liberator. The cold bites through his flight suit. The gun shudders like a living creature. Out of the cloud deck, a Japanese Zero flashes across his sight line, cutting left to right barely 300 yards out. Instinct takes over. Eddie centers the reticle on the enemy's fuselage and squeezes both triggers. The Brownings roar. Brass casings cascade onto the floor, and bright tracer lines streak through the gray air. Every one of them slides harmlessly behind the Zero's tail. The fighter never flinches. It glides out of sight, untouched, while Eddie stares in disbelief. He hadn't failed. Thousands of gunners were living the same moment in every theater of the war. They were trained, disciplined, armed with the finest heavy machine guns ever built, and still they missed. The Army Air Forces reviewed gun camera footage from dozens of raids in early 1943 and found that trained aerial gunners were scoring less than 4% hits against crossing targets. 96% of rounds vanished into empty sky. A single engagement rarely lasted more than 10 seconds. At 13 rounds per second, a gunner could fire about 130 shots before the attacker pulled away or was gone. 4% of that meant 5 bullets striking home, 5 impacts on an aircraft built to absorb dozens. A Zero or FW-190 could shrug off those wounds and keep flying. The mathematics translated directly into casualties. In 1943, the 8th Air Force in Europe lost roughly 200 bombers every month. Each carried 10 men. 2,000 aircrew gone every 30 days. Many were lost not because the bombers lacked guns, but because their gunners couldn't connect. They were doing everything their training demanded: track, steady, squeeze, correct. None of it mattered. The flaw wasn't courage, it was physics, and physics never negotiated. Human intuition insists that you shoot where you see. That works on a rifle range, even on a moving deer. But a fighter streaking across your field of view at 300 miles per hour doesn't stay still long enough for instincts to keep up. The bullet left the Browning's barrel at about 2,900 feet per second. That sounds instantaneous, but at 300 yards, 900 feet, the round took roughly a third of a second to arrive. In that same instant, a fighter moving at 300 miles per hour traveled more than 130 feet forward. The gunner was always aiming at the past. It had a name: deflection error. Military engineers had known the math since the 1920s, but classroom knowledge didn't survive combat. At a 90-degree crossing angle, the required lead could be 20 feet or more ahead of the aircraft's nose. Through a gun sight, 20 feet looked like empty sky. To hit, a gunner had to ignore every instinct he possessed. Training schools tried. At bases from Laredo, Texas to Tyndall Field, Florida, students memorized charts of lead angles, practiced on moving trucks with towed targets, watched films explaining bullet travel time. Then they went to war and missed exactly as before. The variables were endless: target speed, crossing angle, climb or dive rate, the bomber's own motion, altitude, wind. A ball turret gunner tracking a Bf-109 diving through the formation needed one deflection angle. The same plane attacking from the front required another. The brain had 4 seconds to compute trigonometry while flak burst around it. Even those who tried to compensate often gave up. They'd aim ahead, watch tracers streak through nothing, and conclude they'd led too far. Next burst, they pulled the sights back toward the target, reinforcing the very mistake that doomed them. Film analysis from 1943 missions shows this spiral perfectly. First bursts ahead, next bursts creeping backward until the gunner was firing directly at the enemy or even behind it. The cost was catastrophic. During the Schweinfurt raids that autumn, 1 in 5 bombers never returned. Crews debriefed the same way. They fired, their guns worked, but the bullets seemed cursed. In truth, the curse was arithmetic. The answer had been sitting in a forgotten folder since 1924. An artillery instructor named Major James R. Putnam had written a paper titled Predictive Fire in Aerial Gunnery. He'd fought in the First World War and seen how even then, slow biplanes forced gunners to lead. His analysis was brutal. As airspeeds increased beyond 150 miles per hour, he calculated, the required lead surpassed what any person could judge by eye. At 250 miles per hour, 200 yards, 90-degree crossing angle, the gunner had to aim almost 50 feet ahead. Without mechanical help, he warned, aerial machine gun fire would soon become marksmanship of faith rather than science. The Army filed the report away. Through the interwar years, aviation advanced while training stayed frozen in 1918. Cadets practiced on tethered balloons and towed sleeves, moving at lazy speeds. The doctrine clung to the myth of the American marksman, the frontier rifleman's eye transposed to the sky. By Pearl Harbor, that myth was a death sentence. When the losses mounted, desperate officers began ransacking archives for solutions. One of them, Captain Robert Wills, found Putnam's forgotten study in a metal cabinet at Wright Field. He read it twice and sent a memo to his superior. The numbers were right 20 years ago, they're still right now. The dead prove it. But mathematics alone couldn't retrain thousands of men. You couldn't ask a 19-year-old under fire to compute vectors. If equations failed, something else had to work. Instinct trained differently, or machinery that could think for him. Across the Atlantic, the British had already begun tackling the same nightmare. During the Battle of Britain, squadron leader Howard Darley of No. 609 Squadron had grounded his pilots for 3 days in the middle of the campaign. Their gunnery footage showed barely 6 hits per 100 rounds. Darley, once a champion clay pigeon shooter, recognized a parallel. Clay shooters don't calculate. They feel the lead. He told his pilots to stop aiming, to watch the target's motion, swing naturally, and fire while still turning. The first attempts were disasters. Bullet patterns nowhere near the banners they were supposed to hit. He made them keep going, 40 runs each, over and over. By the 3rd day, something clicked. Hit rates doubled. Not miracles, just numbers that meant twice as many German planes damaged enough to crash later.
Darley reported his results up the chain. The RAF bureaucracy scoffed, but the combat squadrons paid attention. They began teaching deflection by rhythm, not math. Move, feel, fire. Some units improved, others ignored it, but by early 1941, the method had spread quietly. American observers in Britain took notes. They realized the principle might work for fighter pilots who could maneuver their whole aircraft to create lead, but it couldn't help bomber gunners fixed inside metal spheres. Those men needed a machine that could predict for them. That machine came from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Hidden behind a deliberately misleading name, the Radiation Laboratory, a team led by Dr. Charles Stark Draper was designing instruments that solved what the human mind couldn't. Draper specialized in gyroscopes. He understood that gunnery wasn't about aiming, it was about prediction. By mid-1943, his lab produced the Mark 14 computing gunsight. It was a marvel of analog engineering. Gears, cams, and gyros whirring together to calculate where the target would be by by the time bullets arrived. The gunner matched the enemy's wingspan on a dial to estimate range, tracked the target for 2 seconds, and then simply placed the glowing reticle where the sight told him. The mechanism solved the deflection equation 30 times per second. Tests at Norfolk Naval Air Station astonished everyone. Novice gunners who'd never broken 5% accuracy suddenly hit 18% on the first day. After a week, some reached 25. In statistical terms, they were killing 5 times more planes. The problem was scale. Manufacturing and installing thousands of these complex sights took months. Production priorities went to new aircraft, leaving existing squadrons with nothing but their old reflector sights. They needed something that worked now with what they had. The solution would come not from scientists, but from a combat veteran named Sergeant Bill Fleming. Stationed aboard the Saratoga in early 1944, he'd flown over 30 missions as a turret gunner and survived 4 ditchings. He wasn't an engineer, but after each fight, he sketched what he saw, enemy aircraft, and where he'd aimed when he actually hit. In his notebook, those marks translated into rough distances: 1 plane length, 2, 3. Offering to debriefing, he showed the notes to Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hara, one of the Navy's most respected tacticians. O'Hara grasped the importance immediately. Fleming's crude drawings were data from real combat, a visual table of effective lead distances. O'Hara ordered him to teach it fleet-wide. Fleming's method was brutally simple. On the flight deck, a crewman held a wooden model of a plane at the end of a long pole and walked across the line of gunners. As the model crossed, trainees practiced aiming not at it, but ahead. 1 plane length for shallow angles, 2 for moderate, 3 for sharp. No equations, no instruments, only visual memory. When the Saratoga's gunnery officer compared records, the results were undeniable. Before the new training, hit rates averaged 4%. 6 weeks later, they exceeded 9. Word spread through the Pacific like wildfire. By that summer, carriers across the fleet were running Fleming drills. The logic behind it was psychological as much as physical. Humans are poor at estimating abstract distance. 50 feet means nothing in the haze of combat, but we excel at comparing relative size. Every Zero or Val bomber became its own ruler. 2 plane lengths ahead was something a brain under stress could remember. By mid-1943, the Army Air Forces formalized a similar technique under a new name: radius of action shooting. Training manuals illustrated lead distances in multiples of wingspans. The gunnery school at Lavenham rebuilt its curriculum around it. Loss rates began to edge downward. July 1944 missions saw bomber attrition fall from over 5% to roughly 3.5%. That percentage translated into hundreds of men living to fly another day. Yet knowledge alone wasn't enough. Instructors soon discovered that during real attacks, many gunners forgot everything. Combat psychologists attached to the 8th Air Force filmed turret engagements and interviewed crews afterward. They found a recurring failure they called threat fixation collapse. Gunners would begin an attack using proper deflection, but as the fighter closed and adrenaline surged, they reverted to pointing directly at the threat. The closer death came, the smaller their lead became. Captain Harold Klein, an Air Force's psychologist stationed in England, analyzed the footage frame by frame. The shift was visible. At long range, tracers led correctly. As the attacker filled the screen, the aim point slid backward until the streams of bullets chased the fighter's tail. Under mortal stress, instinct overrode training. The only cure was repetition so relentless that the act of leading became subconscious, like walking or catching a ball. Late 1944 training programs doubled in length to 10 weeks and quintupled ammunition allowances. Recruits now fired 5,000 rounds before graduation, most at moving targets traveling realistic speeds. Naval gunnery schools in Florida introduced motorized turrets that spun and elevated while high-speed boats towed banners across the water. Students fired 50 to 70 passes a day. Instructors gave almost no verbal feedback. The hits themselves taught the brain faster than lectures could. Veterans who survived 30 missions displayed what analysts called automatic deflection. Even under heavy attack, their tracers remained where they should be. Film reviews showed their aim points steady while explosions rocked their planes. When interviewed, they often said they couldn't explain how, they just felt where to fire. The conscious mind panicked, the hands did their job anyway. This was unconscious competence, the state martial artists call mushin, no mind. But creating that level of mastery demanded time and bullets, both of which were scarce commodities. The strategic math was unforgiving. Training an expert gunner took 10 weeks and 5,000 rounds. The air campaign needed 50,000 new gunners in 6 months. Many would never progress beyond partial mastery.
As a result, bomber formations were uneven. A crew lucky enough to include veterans could defend itself with surgical accuracy. A group of replacements might disintegrate under the same attack. German pilots learned to recognize the difference, diving on aircraft whose tracers wandered and avoiding those whose first bursts came close. The shift from instinct to physics had begun to pay off, but the deeper transformation went further than survival statistics. It rewired how militaries thought about aiming itself. By 1945, engineers were already improving Draper's gunsight into the Mark 18, which would serve through Korea. Analog gears gave way to electric servos, then to digital computers that solved deflection equations thousands of times per second. By Vietnam, fighters like the F-4 Phantom carried radar-assisted lead computing sights that required only that the pilot keep the target inside a circle. The machinery did the rest. Yet the principle remained identical. Never fire at where the target is, always at where it will be. That axiom migrated from cockpits to every weapon system conceived afterward. The Navy's Phalanx CIWS, guarding ships against missiles, fires 75 rounds per second while its radar continually updates deflection in real time. The bullets still traveled through the same sky Eddie Merrick fired into, only now guided by computers doing what his instincts never could. Even video game combat simulators preserve the lesson. New players in digital dogfights repeat 1943 all over again, shooting at the enemy's tail until they learn to aim ahead. The moment they finally connect, they feel the same revelation the real gunners did. The mind was the last obstacle. By the war's end, the average hit rate of American bomber defenses had quadrupled. Missions that once ended with half the formation lost began returning nearly intact. No new miracle weapon accomplished it, only a change in understanding. Soldiers learned to distrust their own senses, to fire at nothing and believe that physics would deliver the kill. They proved that instinct could be rewritten by discipline and necessity. Over the burning skies of Europe and the Pacific, thousands of airmen discovered that survival sometimes meant aiming at emptiness and trusting that reality would meet them halfway. For many who lived it, that shift was invisible at first. Crews simply noticed that the new boys were coming home more often, that tracer streams from other bombers began intersecting with attacking fighters instead of trailing behind them. Mission briefings grew calmer. Debriefings no longer sounded like funerals. A quiet evolution was taking hold in the air, not through new airplanes or engines, but through human adaptation. By late 1944, the data told the story with cold precision. The 8th Air Force, which had once lost 1 bomber out of every 5 dispatched on deep raids, now averaged fewer than 1 in 20. Improved escort fighters and longer-range fuel tanks played their part, but analysts credited a surprising share of the reduction to better defensive accuracy. Every percentage of improvement in hit probability saved hundreds of lives each month. The mathematics of survival had finally tilted toward the Allies. Still, the process wasn't uniform. Some gunnery schools became factories of excellence, others lagged behind. The difference often came down to instructors who understood that teaching deflection wasn't about words, it was about imprinting reflexes. The most effective instructors were those who had survived combat themselves. They taught by experience rather than manual. One veteran at Laredo used to stand behind his trainees and shout a single phrase as they fired at moving targets. "Don't look, feel the motion." When students protested that they couldn't see where to aim, he told them to stop thinking like marksmen and start thinking like hunters. It worked. The human brain, exposed to thousands of repetitions, built a new reflex where none had existed before. Neural patterns that once insisted, "aim at what you see," began to translate motion into offset. Scientists studying returning gunners after the war found evidence of what psychologists now call procedural memory hardening. A behavior repeated under pressure becomes nearly immune to conscious override. Once learned deeply enough, the body performs it automatically even under extreme stress. Combat proved it. Camera footage from late-war raids over Germany shows a striking difference from film shot just a year earlier. Tracer lines now intersected attackers in perfect lead angles. Bursts of fire met fighters head-on. When one bomber in a formation began hitting, surrounding aircraft seemed to copy the rhythm instinctively, turning the entire defensive ring into a synchronized storm of lead. Luftwaffe pilots who survived described the new formations as walls of prediction, impossible to penetrate without taking damage. The improvement didn't erase fear. Inside every turret and waist compartment, the noise, vibration, and claustrophobia remained the same. Oxygen masks still froze solid at altitude, hydraulic fluid still leaked onto gloves, and flak still tore through aluminum like paper. But gunners no longer felt helpless. They had evidence that skill mattered, that their bullets could actually reach their targets if they trusted the counterintuitive logic drilled into them. Morale rose accordingly. Not all innovations came from official channels. Across the Pacific, crews devised their own visual shorthand. Some painted small dots or lines on their gun sights corresponding to 1, 2, or 3 plane-length leads. Others cut translucent films from old map sheets to mark expected offsets at typical engagement ranges. These improvisations, passed quietly from crew to crew, did more to reinforce training than any manual. What mattered was having a physical reminder of where to shoot when panic blurred memory. By the start of 1945, deflection shooting had ceased to be a mystery. It had become doctrine. Aerial gunnery handbooks distributed to every base now included pages of diagrams showing not only lead distances, but also examples of sight pictures as they should look at different crossing angles. Where once the diagrams showed the enemy aircraft centered in the crosshairs, they now showed the crosshairs floating somewhere in front of it, on what seemed to be empty sky. The captions read simply, "Fire here."
Those pages represented a fundamental change in military thinking. Acceptance that human intuition is unreliable in fast-moving systems. The same principle began filtering into naval artillery, anti-aircraft fire control, and even tank gunnery. Everywhere speeds were increasing, commanders realized that success required prediction rather than reaction. Mechanical innovation followed close behind. Draper's Mark 14 sight evolved rapidly. Engineers replaced its bulky gyroscopes with smaller, faster-spinning units, and swapped some of the mechanical cams for miniature electric servos. The result? The Mark 18 appeared too late to influence the war's outcome, but set the standard for the next generation of weapon control. It could compute new deflection angles 50 times a second, an astonishing speed for a device powered entirely by analog circuits. For the first time, machines were thinking faster than humans could blink. Yet veterans like Eddie Merrick knew that no machine could replace the human component. The Mark 18 still demanded steady tracking and range estimation. It simply gave the gunner a guidepost. Experience remained the difference between a clean burst and wasted ammunition. After the war, when engineers asked combat crews what they wanted in future systems, the most common answer wasn't more automation. It was, "Make the sight show me what my instincts already feel." They wanted machines that complemented human perception, rather than replacing it. The philosophy spread quietly through all post-war design. The radar-directed guns of the Korean War, the computerized sights of Vietnam, and eventually the digital targeting pods of modern jets all trace their lineage back to that demand for prediction made visible. The hardware changed, but the logic stayed. Calculate where the target will be and place the shooter there first. By the 1960s, aerial warfare had evolved far beyond the conditions of World War II. Missiles replaced most guns, engagements stretched over dozens of miles, and the deflection problem appeared to vanish. But engineers knew it never truly disappeared. It had only moved into software. The same equations that once guided a .5 caliber stream now guided radar-homing warheads. Every missile's guidance computer still solved Putnam's ancient problem thousands of times a second, estimating position, velocity, and lead angles so that steel and explosives would meet the future location of an enemy aircraft. Inside the algorithms of an IM-120 or Sidewinder lives the ghost of every airgunner who learned to fire at nothing. The same trigonometry that once doomed Eddie Merrick's first burst now ensures that an invisible missile, traveling faster than sound, arrives exactly where its target is about to be. The context changed, but the logic stayed. In training programs for modern fighter pilots, gunnery instruction persists even though actual gunfights are rare. At the Navy Fighter Weapons School, the course known as Top Gun still includes guns-only exercises. Instructors explain that the purpose isn't nostalgia, but perception. Learning to judge lead visually teaches spatial reasoning, closure rate, and anticipation. Skills that translate directly to missile combat and evasive maneuvering. The tradition of deflection lives on not because the cannon remains primary, but because prediction is the core of all combat. Outside the military, echoes of the same principle appear everywhere. Automated turrets, defending warships, the Phalanx CIWS, fire 4,000 rounds per minute at incoming missiles. Their radars perform precisely what Fleming's notebook once did by hand: measure relative motion, compute lead, and fire where the target will be. Ground-based counter-rocket systems perform similar miracles, destroying artillery shells in flight by projecting their future paths. Each system is a mechanical descendant of the insight won at such terrible cost above Europe and the Pacific. Even entertainment preserves it. In combat flight simulators, new players experience the same frustration that once haunted real gunners. They aim straight at the enemy, miss, and gradually learn to lead. The moment the tracers finally connect, every player experiences the same revelation those wartime crews felt 80 years earlier. The eye lies, but physics tells the truth. Historians often focus on the machines of war: engines, armor, tonnage. Yet the deflection revolution was a triumph of cognition, not engineering. It proved that human behavior, even something as deeply rooted as the instinct to aim at what you see, can be rewired when survival demands it. It showed that understanding is more powerful than equipment, that training the mind to anticipate beats any number of extra guns. For the men who lived through it, that understanding carried a quieter weight. They knew how many comrades had died before the lesson was learned. Each improvement in accuracy represented not just better mathematics, but fewer funerals. When survivors of the early missions met newer crews late in the war, they often marveled at how calm the rookies seemed under attack. What the rookies didn't realize was that their composure rested on a decade of trial, error, and blood. After the war, psychologists studied those veterans to understand how humans adapt under pressure. They found that the transition from conscious aiming to instinctive deflection paralleled the stages of skill acquisition in other complex tasks. At first, novices relied entirely on intellect, trying to think their way through angles and speeds. With practice, cognition yielded to intuition. The point at which thinking stopped and action began marked true mastery. In modern terms, it was an early demonstration of neuroplasticity forged under extreme conditions.
That research would later influence everything from sports coaching to spaceflight training. Astronauts learning to dock spacecraft practiced predictive motion the same way gunners had, by feeling trajectories rather than calculating them. The intellectual lineage runs in a straight line from the Mark 14 site to the Apollo guidance computer and onward to every automated targeting algorithm in existence. For Eddie Merrick and thousands like him, those connections were invisible. What they carried home were memories: the hammering guns, the smell of hot oil, the frozen oxygen lines, and the flashes of tracers curling through the sky. Some spoke of them freely, others never did, but all shared a common realization. At the height of terror, survival depended on trusting equations they could not see. To live, they had to disobey their senses. That paradox is the heart of the story. Human instinct tells us that reality should match what we perceive. Physics insists otherwise. When the two collide, the universe doesn't yield. We must. The airmen who learned to aim behind their targets weren't just solving a tactical problem. They were demonstrating the broader truth that progress begins when intuition fails.
Long after the bombers were scrapped and the airfields turned quiet, the lesson remained written in the manuals and the memories. Every engineer designing predictive systems, every pilot practicing deflection shots, every algorithm adjusting for target motion, all are descendants of that wartime revelation. The difference between hitting and missing, between living and dying, rests on understanding that the present is already obsolete by the time you see it. The guns have fallen silent, but the principle endures. From radar-guided interceptors to self-driving cars predicting pedestrian paths, the same logic whispers beneath the surface. Don't react to what is, act toward what will be. It is the same wisdom that once transformed confusion into precision high above a world at war. When historians describe the Allied victory, they credit industry, manpower, and strategy. Yet hidden within the statistics is a smaller miracle: the moment humanity caught up with its own machines. It happened not in laboratories or command rooms, but inside the minds of ordinary men staring down at their gun sights, forcing themselves to believe that aiming at nothing was the only way to hit something. Those who survived remembered that feeling for the rest of their lives, the unnatural act of shifting aim away from the enemy, squeezing the trigger, and watching, in disbelief and relief, as tracers curved forward into the path of a diving fighter. It was counterintuitive, terrifying, and utterly correct. In that instant, they understood that the battle wasn't only against the enemy, it was against their own instincts. And winning that battle changed everything. The skies eventually cleared. The bombers stopped flying. The young men who had learned to trust mathematics over intuition returned home to quieter lives. But the rule they lived by, aim for where the world will be, not where it is, outlasted them all, etched permanently into the logic of every predictive system humankind has built since. And so the story of those gunners, their missed shots, and their eventual mastery stands as a reminder. Physics has no sympathy, but it rewards understanding. In the end, survival belonged to those who learned to fire into emptiness and trust that truth would arrive there first.